My name is Nancy. I currently live in a charming suburban house with my husband, John, and his parents. We bought this house as a celebration of our third wedding anniversary. But just a few weeks into our new life here, something straight out of a drama unfolded.
Thank you so much for doing this for us,
said John's parents as they unexpectedly showed up at our doorstep. They came bearing numerous bags and belongings, with a large moving truck parked in front of our home. I stood there, frozen in shock and confusion, as John passed by me with a smile, welcoming his parents warmly.
Dad, Mom, I've been waiting for you. Please come in,
he said cheerfully. Helen, John's mother, turned to me and said,
Nancy, we're looking forward to living with you.
She stepped into our new home, marking the beginning of an unexpected chapter in our lives.
Explain what the whole thing is about,
I asked John in a rush.
This house, it was built to live together with Dad and Mom, right? That's why I invited them over.
His words struck me like a bolt out of the blue. I remembered mentioning in passing that maybe one day we might consider living with my parents. However, the thought of cohabitating with John's parents had never crossed my mind, let alone been a topic of discussion. This sudden turn of events left me utterly bewildered. The idea of living with my parents was a distant possibility, a conversation for another day, not a current plan. Yet, John had taken it upon himself to invite his parents into our home without any prior discussion with me. I couldn't fathom why he would make such a unilateral decision. Caught off guard, I found myself alone with John, confronting him about this unexpected development.
Hey, why did you just go ahead and invite your parents to live with us without talking to me first?
I asked, my voice laced with a blend of surprise and irritation. John, seemingly aware of his oversight, scratched his cheek awkwardly and said,
Well, I thought if we delayed any longer, your parents might end up moving in here. I've always decided that if I were to live with anyone, it would be my own parents.
His casual justification left me speechless. Involuntarily, a sharp
"What?"
escaped my lips, a reflection of the shock and disbelief coursing through me. His words, so unexpected and unilaterally decided, threw our shared life into a whirlwind of emotion and complexity. The day my husband John said living with my parents would be fine is still vivid in my memory. But now that I think about it, his agreement might have just been a way to avoid a clash with me. He always chooses the path of least resistance. And before we even had a serious discussion about my parents moving in, he quickly invited his own parents. It felt like a calculated move on his part.
What's the meaning of this? You were so understanding when my parents wanted to move in. Why suddenly invite yours without consulting me and announce they're moving in today? I just can't understand,
I exclaimed, shaking with anger. My voice was high, my emotions translating directly into words. My heart was a raging storm.
But I have my own thoughts too. You rushed me for an answer, so I had no choice but to agree at that time,
he replied as if it were an excuse. There was no hint of disturbance in his voice, as if everything was part of his plan.
I wasn't rushing you. It was just a question. What do you think?
I retorted, confused and flustered by his response. I just wanted to know his opinion as my husband.
I've always wanted to live with my parents,
John said quietly, yet with a voice filled with conviction. His eyes held some sort of resolve.
Then you should have mentioned that when I brought up living with my parents. Don't act like a child.
I raised my voice, filled with frustration and anger towards him. Living with John has revealed how childlike he can be. He always curiously asks,
What are you doing?
Whenever I'm engaged in something. His curiosity can be endearing but sometimes tiresome. He even watches me do household chores with an innocence reminiscent of a child's. Really, a child might be better, I mused to myself. A child might take up the offer to help with chores out of curiosity. But John, he simply says,
Housework is women's work,
refusing to lend a hand. His attitude often leaves me baffled. Handling an adult child like John is more challenging than a little one. His presence has made the future of my life unpredictable. I was filled with anxiety and worry. It seems our marital disputes were also overheard by my mother-in-law, Helen. She began to treat me coldly afterwards. When alone with me, she started the conversation sternly.
Nancy, listen. There might be things you find hard to accept, but as a married couple, some compromise is necessary.
Helen said calmly but with conviction. Her voice carried an expectation and a certain sternness towards me. Her words were a silent pressure, urging me to give in. It seems that my in-laws, George and Helen, only see me as an accessory to their son, John. In their eyes, I'm merely a part of his life, not an independent individual with my own thoughts and feelings. They probably think that my reluctance to live with them is just a trivial matter. Yet, in my perspective, John is a part of my life, and we are partners who support each other. Unfortunately, they seem oblivious to the dynamics of our relationship. Helen, my mother-in-law, always insists on doing the household chores, but their attitude towards me is quite discomforting. I tried to understand their behavior, but as it grew worse, I found myself contemplating the nature of our relationship more deeply. Then, unexpectedly, my sister-in-law, Sarah, who is 5 years younger than me and has been through 3 divorces, came to visit. She's currently with her new husband, trying to make a fresh start. One day, when I returned home, Sarah was waiting in the living room with a smile. "Welcome back, Nancy,"
she exclaimed cheerfully. "I heard about it. You're clashing with your brother and trying to kick mom and dad out of the house, huh?"
I was taken aback and glared at John, who was sitting next to her. Why on earth would he share such a thing with Sarah? He awkwardly avoided my gaze, clearly uncomfortable. I wanted to tell him not to paint me as the villain in the first place, but Sarah, unaware of my thoughts, stepped forward to defend her brother.
"Don't look at me like that, Nancy,"
she said.
"Just like I heard, you really are a tough wife to handle. If someone like you is around, it might affect the baby negatively. So, you should leave."
I was astonished.
Leave? What do you mean?
I was bewildered, trying to grasp the meaning behind her abrupt demand. Sarah's sudden ultimatum left me in utter confusion. Did she mean that I should leave this room because she wanted to have a nice chat with her brother? Confused and a bit shocked by this turn of events, I tried to understand what Sarah, my sister-in-law, really meant. She gently stroked her belly, speaking in a calm voice.
"I've decided to go back to my parents' house for my childbirth. So, I'd like you to stay away from here until I leave this house."
Hearing these words, I felt a surge of surprise and anger, and couldn't help but respond coldly with,
"What?"
Sarah, noticing my reaction, scoffed with a hint of disdain.
"Oh, Nancy, your face looks so scary. It's that attitude of yours that's driving my brother away. It won't be long before he leaves you too,"
she said mockingly. Hurt by her words and attitude, I turned to look at John, my husband. He was avoiding my gaze, his eyes fixed on the ground. Normally, a husband would react somehow when his wife is insulted so badly, even by his own dear sister. But John's behavior made me wonder if there was some truth in Sarah's words. That thought made me feel like I was beginning to lose my patience with John too. When John invited his parents to our home and started living together without telling me, I was both shocked and unable to forgive him. The fact that his parents spoke ill of me, and his sister Sarah also harbored hostility towards me, was unbearable. John's actions seemed to scream that he didn't value me at all, leaving me deeply hurt. I kept asking myself why I had to continue to love a man who treated me this way. My love for John disappeared at once, and my feelings for him completely changed.
"Hey, we're short on rooms, so I'll be using yours,"
Sarah announced, adding with a laugh,
"Pack up your stuff quickly. Come on, brother, tell her. You've suffered a lot from a terrible wife, haven't you?"
His sister stirred him up, and he smiled sarcastically at me.
Why don't you sleep outside? My dear sister is coming home to give birth, and you're just in the way.
Reflecting on our 3 years of marriage, I sighed and simply replied,
Okay.
Sarah cheered joyfully, raising her hands in the air, while John looked relieved. However, in my heart, I had no intention of forgiving John, Sarah, or his parents anymore. That evening, at our family dinner table, a critical decision was made by me. I handed the divorce papers to my husband, John. His face, a mixture of surprise and bewilderment, couldn't conceal his astonishment. I spoke with a calm, yet resolute voice.
You want me to leave our home, don't you? Then could you please sign these papers? If you don't, I won't leave.
My sister-in-law, Sarah, interjected casually.
Oh, just sign it. If you don't really want to divorce, just comply with her demands. I've done that myself before. Nancy won't actually file them, will she?
It seemed Sarah had been using signed divorce papers as a means to control her partners. Reflecting on such a manipulative tactic filled me with anguish. John, naively believing her, signed the papers effortlessly. The fact that he thought of this only as a ploy hurt me deeply. Divorce papers should be used only in earnest decisions to part ways. Nevertheless, getting his signature more easily than I had anticipated allowed me a sigh of relief. Now, I was free to pursue my plans for retribution unimpeded. After much contemplation and inner turmoil, I made the firm decision to file for divorce at the local office. This decision, marked by a whirlwind of emotions swirling within me, was a culmination of prolonged doubts and conflicts. Leaving the office, I returned home to take the first step towards a new path in my life, beginning with the daunting task of packing my belongings. As I packed, I couldn't help but reflect on my married life, with a myriad of memories flooding my mind. During this time, I sensed the worried gaze of my sister-in-law, Sarah, who was still undecided about returning to this house. She had kindly mentioned that she would stay away until I had finished organizing my room. I was grateful for her thoughtfulness as I quietly sorted through my belongings after returning from work each day. This sequence of events was a new beginning for me, a step towards the future. I started looking for an apartment suitable for living alone, and soon found a cozy place that felt just right, a beacon of hope for my new life. I then began the process of selling the house I currently lived in. After moving my belongings to the new apartment, I decided it was time to visit my in-laws' house. There, I found my husband John, Sarah, and my in-laws, George and Helen, all gathered together. They seemed a bit startled by my sudden visit. Upon my arrival, they were enjoying a casual family time with drinks, though pregnant Sarah was sensibly sticking to juice. At that moment, John began to speak to his family, and his words caught me off guard, deeply wounding my heart.
Oh, I'm so relieved that Nancy finally left. She was like a tyrant, making my life miserable. I always thought she'd listen if I got angry. It's just been so frustrating.
His words reflected the complexity of our marriage. Helen, my mother-in-law, agreed with him, adding,
Indeed, Nancy did seem a bit intimidating.
Her words further pierced my heart, but I was determined to overcome this moment and move forward into my new life. My anger was directed at John for deciding to live with his family without consulting me, and for his attitude that seemed to prioritize Sarah over me, almost pushing me out of our home. This not only hurt my feelings, but also disturbed the balance in our household. If he had shown a bit more consideration, I wouldn't have been this upset. Yet, within his family, I felt treated like an antagonist, almost a villain. It's as if I did something wrong. Especially Sarah, his sister, seemed to look down on me, causing me more emotional pain.
You know, I've been thinking John might be better suited with someone more gentle and charming. Remember the lady I introduced last week? I heard they started dating. Don't you think she's a better match than Nancy?
Sarah's comment was like a dagger to my heart, implying that John moving on with another woman was perfectly fine. However, I had already filed for divorce, so their actions were of no concern to me anymore. I was there to listen to their conversation and respond if I had anything to say. Then, I opened a door to the room where the family was gathered and looked at each of the 4 people there. Their faces were filled with surprise. They hadn't expected me to show up. Standing behind me was Steve, the real estate agent.
Nancy, who is that man?
John pointed to Steve, standing behind me, his face a mix of shock and confusion. He seemed worried about whether I had overheard their conversation. Before I could respond, Sarah jumped in.
Oh, could that be Nancy's lover? Hey, John, you should ask Nancy for alimony.
Her words added to the misunderstanding and shock of the situation. I was utterly astounded when she, after introducing a new woman to her brother, demanded alimony from him. Unruffled by her words, the real estate agent, Steve, calmly handed his business card to my father-in-law, George. Holding the card, George looked puzzled and tilted his head, wondering,
"A real estate agent here. What could possibly be the reason?"
With confidence, Steve replied,
"I've come to appraise this house."
George and his wife Helen exchanged glances and chuckled.
"We plan to live in this house for many more years. There's no need for an appraisal,"
George declared firmly. However, Steve confidently stated,
"Actually, the owner of this house, Nancy, has expressed a desire to sell. We will ensure it's sold at a fair price."
George and Helen were taken aback, seemingly unaware of such plans. Probably their son, John, hadn't shared any details about the house's ownership with them. Their attitude made it clear to me that he hadn't. I had realized that my relationship with John had grown cold, and he seemed to consider me merely an accessory. It appeared he thought he had bought this house, and that I was financially supporting him. I decided to wait and see. If things didn't improve, I was ready to have a frank discussion with John and his parents about the fact that the house was in my name and why John was in financial distress. But before I could have that conversation, John's sister, Sarah, unexpectedly showed up. Despite my being the legal owner, she attempted to drive me out of the house. Realizing that negotiating with this in-law family was futile, I resolved to take a more drastic approach. First, I would find a new place for myself. Once I had moved out, I planned to sell the house immediately. John seemed to think I wouldn't divorce him, no matter his attitude towards me. His face, struck with surprise, was like a pigeon hit by a beanbag, comically bewildered. I couldn't help but sigh at his ludicrous expression.
This house is in my name, so it's only natural for me to sell it, right? Especially after being forced out,
I stated firmly. His reaction was surprisingly intense.
But, this house is as much yours as it is mine. And currently, my parents, George and Helen, are living here, not to mention my sister, Sarah,
he protested. I responded calmly.
So what? Your presence or your family's doesn't change anything for me. Besides, do you still think we're a married couple?
His bewildered echoed in response.
We've been divorced for a while now. Remember signing the divorce papers? I filed them the same day,
I informed him. His reaction indicated his disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom the reality. Believing our divorce was just a threat showed his naivety. I sighed again, unable to hide my exasperation. Then Sarah chimed in.
Wait a minute, sis. You bought the house with my brother's money and put it under your name? That's really low, even for you.
Her accusation was sharp and clear. Who do you think caused this mess? I looked at Sarah, seated in our living room. My expression was a mix of disbelief and frustration. I said,
Do you really think John has any money? He goes to work, sure, but all his earnings are going towards paying off debts.
Debts? John is in debt? Why?
She asked, her voice echoing the shock in my heart.
Because he's been covering for your infidelity. That's why.
I replied sharply. Sarah, now divorced 3 times, had her previous 2 marriages end over her affairs. Each time, she begged John to keep it a secret from our parents, claiming she couldn't pay and needed help. Initially, I was oblivious. But I eventually noticed our joint savings for our dream house dwindling. Confronting John revealed that he had been covering for her alimony payments. And not just once, but twice. I managed to buy the house with my personal savings. But I couldn't hide my dismay at John secretly paying off his sister's affair-related expenses twice without telling me.
He said he'd pay back someday, but I can't trust him anymore,
I thought. To recover all the savings he squandered, I decided to hire a lawyer. However, before I could break this news, our in-laws found out about their daughter's infidelity and were furious. George, with a look of shock and disbelief, confronted Sarah.
You've been cheating on me. All your previous marriages ended because of incompatibility, but this is unforgivable.
John's mother, Helen, responded sternly.
I never raised a daughter to engage in such vulgar behavior as infidelity. It's despicable.
At that moment, John's sister Sarah interjected anxiously.
Hold on, wait a minute. Mom, Dad, this is just something my sister is saying on her own.
John, who had been visibly distressed, suddenly erupted in anger.
I had to shoulder the alimony because of you, and I even got into debt. If I sign the divorce papers like you said, I'll have to divorce Nancy. It's all your fault,
I retorted.
No, this is all on you. You were the one who invited your parents into the house that's in my name, and you've been calling me the bad wife all along. And let's not forget how you favored your sister, kicked me out of my own house, and then had the audacity to tell me to be homeless. This is unacceptable.
John tried to apologize, but before he could get out more than a
Nancy,
I shook off his hand and declared,
I'm going to claim back every penny you squandered. I'll be here with my lawyer tomorrow, so be prepared.
With those words, I left the house. While we were discussing, the appraisal of the house had fortunately been completed. It looks like the house will be sold successfully. When I visited with the lawyer, I presented detailed documentation of the money that John had misused. As we discussed this, his parents, George and Helen, intensely scrutinized the documents. Suddenly, Helen exclaimed,
With all this money, and it's all because of Sarah's affair.
She glared angrily at Sarah, who was standing quietly in a corner of the room. It seemed that George and Helen had been under the impression that John had invited them to live with us, promising to take care of them in their later years. However, the harsh reality of John's lies and Sarah's infidelity, putting their financial security at risk, became painfully clear, igniting a fierce anger in them. John, in a desperate attempt to settle his debts, amassed whatever money he could and paid me back in full. Subsequently, he and his family were briskly ousted from the home. Now, the four of them were relegated to living in a modest apartment. Sarah, overwhelmed by the harsh judgment from her family, temporarily returned to her husband. However, when it became evident that her newborn child was unmistakably not her husband's, she was once again expelled from the home. Given Sarah's inability to properly care for her child, the baby was placed in a care facility. Left with no other choice, Sarah returned to her family, who treated her as the villain. She now faces daily harassment from intimidating debt collectors. But that's no longer my concern. As for me, I'm currently enjoying my solitude, embracing the peace of single life, and entertaining the thought of finding new love in the near future.